In the Syrian desert, 30 kilometers northeast of Damascus, the monastery of Mar Musa al-Habashi operated according to design principles formulated across 15 centuries of institutional evolution. The community functioned within governance structures that had been refined through countless iterations of monastic rule, each adjustment preserving the essential architectural logic of contemplative life while adapting surface practices to immediate circumstances. The monastery's operational framework assumed fundamental continuities: a predominantly Christian regional population, stable political arrangements that recognized religious neutrality, and cultural transmission mechanisms that would perpetuate traditional pilgrimage patterns and local support networks. These assumptions were not arbitrary. They reflected documented historical patterns that had sustained the institution through previous periods of political transition. The monastery had survived successive waves of Islamic conquest, Ottoman administration, French mandate, and modern Syrian statehood by maintaining its essential character while accommodating changing external authorities. The institutional memory encoded in monastic rules and governance protocols represented a sophisticated information processing system designed to distinguish between temporary disruptions, requiring tactical adjustment, and fundamental shifts demanding strategic transformation. The monastic rule itself functioned as the primary control logic for institutional decision-making. Unlike secular organizations that rely on explicit management hierarchies and formal reporting structures, the monastery operated through spiritual authority patterns that distributed operational control across multiple overlapping systems. The abbot held ultimate administrative responsibility, but daily decisions emerged from communal discernment processes guided by scriptural interpretation, liturgical calendars, and accumulated precedent. This distributed control architecture had proven remarkably resilient during historical stress periods because it avoided single points of failure while maintaining coherent institutional identity. However, the monastery's information architecture contained embedded assumptions about the relationship between internal spiritual metrics and external environmental conditions. The community measured institutional health primarily through indicators of contemplative depth, liturgical consistency, and theological fidelity. External engagement was evaluated according to traditional categories of hospitality, charitable works, and missionary activity. These measurement systems had evolved during periods when regional Christian populations provided a stable demographic foundation and when political authorities maintained consistent policies toward religious communities. The interface between monastery and environment operated through established communication channels that filtered external information according to spiritual relevance criteria. Regional political developments were assessed primarily for their impact on religious freedom and community safety. Demographic shifts registered mainly through changes in pilgrimage patterns and local Christian population requests for pastoral services. Economic pressures appeared in monastery records as resource allocation adjustments, rather than existential threats requiring fundamental institutional restructuring. This filtering system created systematic blind spots in environmental scanning capabilities. The monastic information processing framework excelled at identifying spiritual opportunities and theological challenges while remaining largely insensitive to gradual institutional obsolescence. Community leadership was trained to interpret external pressures as occasions for deepening contemplative practice rather than signals requiring adaptive response. Decline in external support was understood as purification rather than warning. Isolation from contemporary cultural currents was celebrated as authentic witness rather than recognized as institutional drift toward irrelevance. The governance protocols encoded specific assumptions about temporal relationships between spiritual authenticity and institutional sustainability. The monastic tradition maintained that faithfulness to contemplative principles would naturally generate external support and recognition. Communities that prioritized theological integrity and liturgical excellence could expect divine providence to provide material necessities and cultural relevance. This spiritual material feedback loop had operated effectively during historical periods when regional populations shared the monastery's theological framework, and when political systems recognized religious authority as legitimate cultural force. The community's approach to institutional planning reflected these embedded assumptions about providential sustainability. Long-term strategic thinking focused on preserving theological authenticity and contemplative depth rather than analyzing demographic trends or developing adaptive capacity for changing external conditions. Resource allocation prioritized library maintenance, liturgical equipment, and spiritual formation programs over environmental scanning systems or external relationship management. The monastery's planning horizons were measured in liturgical cycles and monastic generations rather than regional demographic projections or political stability assessments. Training protocols for community members reinforced these operational priorities through spiritual formation processes that emphasized interior transformation over external adaptation. New monks learned to interpret institutional challenges as occasions for spiritual growth rather than problems requiring systematic analysis and strategic response. The formation curriculum prioritized scriptural study, contemplative prayer, and theological reflection, while providing minimal instruction in environmental assessment or institutional change management. This training architecture produced community members who excelled at spiritual discernment while remaining systematically unprepared for institutional adaptation during periods of environmental transition. The monastery's communication systems with external authorities operated through traditional channels that assumed continued recognition of religious neutrality and ecclesiastical autonomy. Relationships with government officials were maintained through ceremonial protocols rather than strategic partnerships. Connections with regional Christian leaders followed hierarchical patterns established during periods of Christian demographic dominance. Interface protocols with Muslim neighbors relied on historical precedents of mutual respect rather than contemporary frameworks for interfaith engagement in contexts of religious minority status. These communication architectures functioned effectively when external parties recognized traditional religious authority and when regional demographics supported continued Christian institutional presence. However, the protocols became progressively less effective as external conditions shifted toward configurations that rendered traditional religious authority patterns obsolete. Government officials increasingly viewed religious communities through security rather than cultural lenses. Regional Islamic leadership operated through contemporary rather than historical frameworks. Local Muslim populations related to Christian institutions according to modern rather than traditional parameters. The community's resource management systems reflected assumptions about renewable support networks that would maintain institutional viability through continued Christian demographic presence and ongoing recognition of monastic cultural value. Financial planning assumed stable income streams from traditional sources, land revenues, pilgrimage donations, ecclesiastical subsidies, and local Christian community contributions. These assumptions had proven valid during historical periods when regional Christian populations maintained sufficient size and economic capacity to support multiple religious institutions. However, demographic mathematics began operating according to different parameters as regional Christian populations declined through emigration and conversion patterns. The monastery's financial planning models did not incorporate systematic demographic analysis or develop alternative resource acquisition strategies appropriate for minority institutional status. Resource allocation continued to follow traditional patterns optimized for stable support networks rather than adaptive strategies designed for declining demographic base and uncertain political environment. The institutional measurement systems that evaluated community effectiveness operated through spiritual, rather than strategic metrics. Success was assessed through indicators of contemplative depth, theological scholarship, and liturgical excellence rather than external relationship quality, institutional sustainability, or adaptive capacity. These measurement frameworks reinforced decision-making patterns that prioritized internal development over external engagement and theological purity over institutional viability. The community's evaluation systems provided extensive feedback about spiritual progress while remaining systematically blind to institutional drift toward obsolescence. The monastery's human factors architecture had evolved through centuries of institutional refinement to optimize contemplative formation and spiritual transmission. Community members underwent systematic training processes designed to cultivate specific cognitive patterns and behavioral responses that supported monastic life according to traditional parameters. These formation protocols created predictable psychological profiles characterized by spiritual sensitivity, theological sophistication, and contemplative depth. However, the same training systems that produced excellence in traditional monastic virtues also generated systematic blind spots regarding environmental assessment and institutional adaptation. The novice formation curriculum established fundamental interpretive frameworks that shaped how community members processed external information throughout their monastic careers. New monks learned to understand worldly concerns as distractions from authentic spiritual priorities and to interpret external pressures as opportunities for deepening contemplative practice. The training emphasized theological categories for analyzing social phenomena rather than strategic frameworks for institutional planning. Novices developed sophisticated abilities to discern spiritual movements and theological nuances while remaining systematically unprepared to assess demographic trends, political developments, or institutional sustainability requirements. This cognitive conditioning created predictable response patterns when community members encountered external challenges. Declining pilgrimage numbers were interpreted as occasions for examining the authenticity of hospitality practices rather than signals requiring strategic marketing or demographic analysis. Reduced local Christian population was understood as divine testing of community faithfulness rather than data requiring institutional adaptation planning. Political tensions were approached through traditional frameworks of religious neutrality and providential trust rather than systematic risk assessment and contingency planning. The monastery's organizational culture reinforced these interpretive patterns through daily practices that prioritized spiritual discernment over strategic analysis. Community meetings focused on theological reflection and pastoral concerns rather than institutional planning and environmental assessment. Decision-making processes emphasized contemplative consensus building rather than systematic problem analysis and strategic response development. The community's communication patterns celebrated spiritual insights while minimizing discussion of practical concerns that might indicate inadequate faith or inappropriate worldly preoccupation. These cultural patterns had proven effective during historical periods when external conditions remained relatively stable and when traditional religious authority provided adequate frameworks for managing institutional challenges. The community's spiritual sophistication enabled nuanced responses to theological controversies and pastoral situations. The emphasis on contemplative depth generated institutional resilience during periods of external persecution or political transition. The prioritization of theological authenticity maintained community identity through successive waves of cultural change. However, the same cultural patterns that produce spiritual excellence also created systematic resistance to environmental scanning and adaptive planning. Community members were conditioned to interpret suggestions for institutional change as symptoms of spiritual immaturity or theological compromise. Proposals for strategic planning were understood as evidence of inadequate trust in divine providence. Discussions of external relationship management were viewed as distractions from authentic, contemplative priorities. The community's cultural immune system effectively filtered out information and perspectives that might challenge established spiritual frameworks, even when such information indicated existential institutional threats. The monastery's leadership selection and training systems reflected these cultural priorities. Through promotion criteria that emphasized spiritual maturity and theological expertise, rather than strategic thinking or environmental assessment capabilities. Abbots were chosen for their contemplative depth and pastoral wisdom, rather than their institutional management skills or adaptive planning experience. Senior monks achieved authority through theological scholarship and spiritual direction capabilities rather than strategic analysis or external relationship management. The community's leadership development programs focused on spiritual formation and pastoral training while providing minimal instruction in institutional planning or environmental assessment. This leadership training architecture produced administrators who excelled at spiritual guidance and theological decision-making while remaining systematically unprepared for institutional adaptation during periods of environmental transition. Abbots approached institutional challenges through prayer and theological reflection rather than strategic analysis and adaptive planning. Senior monks interpreted external pressures according to spiritual rather than institutional categories. The leadership team possessed extensive expertise in contemplative practice and theological scholarship while lacking essential skills in demographic analysis, political assessment, or strategic planning. The community's information processing systems operated through spiritual rather than strategic filters that shaped how external data was collected, interpreted, and applied to decision-making. News about regional political developments was evaluated primarily for religious freedom implications rather than institutional planning requirements. Demographic information was assessed according to pastoral rather than strategic categories. Economic trends were understood through providential rather than planning frameworks. This information architecture excelled at identifying spiritual opportunities and theological challenges while remaining systematically blind to institutional sustainability requirements. The monastery's communication protocols with external entities reflected assumptions about continued recognition of traditional, religious authority, and ongoing respect for contemplative expertise. Interactions with government officials emphasized ceremonial courtesy and religious neutrality rather than strategic partnership development or political relationship management. Engagement with local Muslim leaders followed historical patterns of mutual respect rather than contemporary frameworks for interfaith cooperation in changing demographic contexts. Communication with regional Christian communities assumed continued ecclesiastical authority rather than adapted to minority community status, requiring collaborative rather than hierarchical approaches. These communication patterns functioned effectively when external parties recognized traditional religious authority and when regional demographics supported continued Christian institutional dominance. However, the protocols became progressively less effective as external conditions shifted toward configurations that rendered traditional religious authority patterns obsolete. Government officials increasingly operated through security rather than cultural frameworks when assessing religious communities. Local Islamic leadership engaged Christian institutions according to contemporary rather than historical parameters. Regional Christian populations required collaborative rather than hierarchical relationship models appropriate for minority community circumstances. The community's resource acquisition and management systems reflected cultural assumptions about the relationship between spiritual authenticity and material provision. The monastery operated according to providential economic models that assumed faithful contemplative practice would naturally generate necessary external support. Financial planning emphasized traditional revenue sources rather than adaptive strategies appropriate for changing demographic and political conditions. Resource allocation prioritized spiritual development programs over external relationship management or institutional adaptation initiatives. These economic frameworks had proven viable during historical periods when regional Christian populations maintained sufficient size and economic capacity to support multiple religious institutions. The providential model functioned effectively when external communities recognized contemplative value and when traditional pilgrimage patterns provided reliable income streams. However, the same economic assumptions that had supported institutional sustainability during periods of Christian demographic dominance became liability factors during periods of religious minority status, requiring alternative financial strategies and resource acquisition approaches. The monastery's conflict resolution and crisis management protocols operated through spiritual rather than strategic frameworks that emphasized prayer, theological reflection, and contemplative response rather than systematic problem analysis and adaptive planning. Community members were trained to approach institutional challenges as opportunities for spiritual growth rather than problems requiring practical solutions. Crisis situations were managed through increased prayer and liturgical observance rather than strategic assessment and response planning. These spiritual approaches generated community resilience and maintained institutional identity during traditional stress periods. However, the same spiritual crisis management frameworks that had proven effective during historically familiar challenges became inadequate when community faced unprecedented environmental transitions requiring systematic analysis and adaptive response. Prayer and theological reflection, while spiritually valuable, did not provide information necessary for demographic analysis or strategic planning. Contemplative approaches to institutional challenges, while maintaining community morale, did not generate practical solutions appropriate for environmental conditions outside historical experience parameters. The community's measurement and evaluation systems operated through spiritual metrics that assessed institutional health according to contemplative depth, theological authenticity, and liturgical excellence rather than external relationship quality, institutional sustainability, or adaptive capacity. Success was evaluated through indicators of prayer life quality, scholarly productivity, and pastoral effectiveness rather than environmental scanning accuracy, strategic planning capability, or external partnership development. These measurement frameworks reinforced decision-making patterns that prioritized internal spiritual development over external institutional adaptation. The spiritual measurement systems provided extensive feedback about community contemplative progress while remaining systematically blind to institutional drift toward environmental obsolescence. Community leaders received detailed information about prayer life quality, theological scholarship development, and liturgical observance patterns, while lacking systematic data about demographic trends, political developments, or institutional sustainability requirements. This measurement architecture reinforced cognitive patterns that celebrated spiritual achievement, while minimizing attention to practical concerns requiring strategic response. December 31, 2025. The environmental shift that triggered the monastery's institutional crisis began in the early 1980s, when regional demographic patterns that had remained relatively stable for centuries entered a period of accelerated transformation. The Syrian Christian population, which had maintained approximately 12% of national demographics through the Ottoman period and early independence era, began experiencing emigration rates that fundamentally altered the monastery's operational environment. These population movements initially appeared as normal fluctuations within historical parameters, but they represented the beginning of systematic changes that would render traditional monastic operational assumptions obsolete. The monastery's environmental monitoring systems registered these demographic shifts through traditional indicators that filtered information according to pastoral rather than strategic categories. Community records documented declining attendance at regional Christian celebrations and reduced requests for monastic pastoral services. These changes were interpreted through established frameworks that emphasized spiritual rather than institutional analysis. Decreased external engagement was understood as evidence of regional secularization requiring intensified contemplative witness rather than demographic transition requiring institutional adaptation. Regional political developments during this period created additional environmental pressures that operated outside the monastery's historical experience parameters. The Syrian government's approach to religious communities evolved from traditional tolerance models based on historical precedent toward security-focused frameworks that evaluated religious institutions according to contemporary, political, rather than cultural criteria. These policy shifts initially manifested as administrative adjustments that appeared manageable within established operational protocols. Government inspections became more frequent and detailed. Bureaucratic requirements for religious activities increased in complexity. External communication protocols required official approval processes that had not been necessary during previous periods. The monastery's response to these political changes followed established patterns that had proven effective during historical periods of government transition. Community leadership emphasized religious neutrality and ceremonial cooperation with official requirements. External communication protocols maintained traditional courtesy patterns while avoiding political engagement that might compromise contemplative autonomy. Resource management systems adapted to increased bureaucratic requirements through expanded administrative procedures rather than strategic assessment of changing political environment implications for long-term institutional viability. These traditional response patterns functioned adequately during the initial phase of environmental transition because they maintained immediate operational stability while preserving essential institutional identity. The monastery successfully navigated increased government oversight requirements while maintaining contemplative routines and theological programming. Community morale remained stable through emphasis on spiritual rather than institutional concerns. External relationships with regional religious and political authorities continued according to established protocols that emphasized continuity rather than adaptation. However, the cumulative effect of demographic and political changes began creating operational conditions that diverged systematically from the monastery's design assumptions. The combination of declining regional Christian population and evolving government policies toward religious communities generated environmental pressures that operated according to different parameters than those encoded in traditional monastic operational frameworks. The monastery's information processing systems continued to interpret these changes through established spiritual categories that emphasized contemplative response rather than strategic adaptation. The first clear indication that environmental changes exceeded traditional management capabilities appeared in 1985, when regional Islamic groups began questioning the monastery's continued presence in areas that had become predominantly Muslim through demographic transition. These questions initially followed historical patterns of interfaith dialogue that the monastery had successfully managed through traditional theological exchange and mutual respect protocols. Community leadership approached these discussions according to established frameworks that emphasized religious common ground and historical coexistence precedent. The monastery's interfaith engagement protocols operated through theological rather than political categories that assumed continued recognition of contemplative authority and ongoing respect for historical religious precedent. Community representatives engaged Islamic leaders through scriptural dialogue and philosophical discussion rather than strategic negotiation about institutional sustainability in changing demographic contexts. These theological approaches maintained immediate relationship stability while avoiding systematic analysis of long-term viability issues that required strategic rather than spiritual solutions. Regional economic pressures during this period created additional complications that operated outside the monastery's financial planning parameters. Traditional revenue sources began declining as regional Christian populations decreased and as changing political conditions affected pilgrimage patterns. Government regulations regarding religious community economic activities became more restrictive and complex. Local business relationships that had provided stable income streams faced political pressures that rendered traditional economic partnerships problematic. The monastery's financial management systems responded to these economic challenges through traditional resource conservation measures that emphasized spiritual discipline rather than strategic economic planning. Community expenses were reduced through simplified lifestyle choices and decreased external programming. Traditional revenue diversification strategies were implemented through expanded agricultural activities and increased emphasis on donation requests from external Christian communities. These approaches maintained short-term financial stability while avoiding systematic analysis of long-term economic sustainability requirements. The community's external communication systems began registering information that contradicted traditional assumptions about regional religious dynamics and institutional sustainability. Reports from regional Christian leaders indicated systematic emigration patterns among educated and economically mobile community members. Government officials communicated evolving policy frameworks that treated religious communities as security rather than cultural entities. Local Muslim leaders expressed concerns about maintaining historical interfaith cooperation models in changing demographic contexts. This contradictory information created cognitive dissonance within the monastery's decision-making systems that had been optimized for spiritual rather than strategic analysis. Community leadership possessed extensive expertise in theological interpretation and contemplative discernment, while lacking systematic frameworks for analyzing demographic data, political trends, or economic sustainability requirements. The traditional spiritual categories that guided community decision-making provided inadequate analytical tools for processing information about environmental changes outside historical experience parameters. The monastery's response to accumulating environmental pressures followed established spiritual protocols that emphasized prayer, theological reflection, and contemplative response rather than strategic assessment and adaptive planning. Community meetings focused on spiritual discernment regarding divine will rather than systematic analysis of external conditions and institutional response requirements. Decision-making processes prioritize theological authenticity and contemplative consistency rather than environmental assessment and strategic adaptation. These spiritual response patterns maintained community morale and preserved institutional identity while avoiding systematic engagement with environmental changes that required strategic rather than contemplative solutions. The monastery's spiritual sophistication enabled nuanced theological responses to interfaith dialogue opportunities and contemplative interpretations of external pressures. However, the same spiritual frameworks that provided internal stability also created systematic resistance to environmental analysis and strategic planning that would be necessary for institutional adaptation during unprecedented demographic and political transitions. The accumulating environmental pressures began generating operational conditions that operated according to different parameters than those encoded in the monastery's traditional management systems. Declining regional Christian population reduced traditional support networks while increasing religious minority status complications. Evolving government policies created administrative requirements that conflicted with traditional, contemplative autonomy expectations. Changing interfaith dynamics required political rather than purely theological engagement strategies. The monastery's operational systems continued to function according to design specifications, while external conditions shifted toward configurations that rendered traditional institutional assumptions obsolete. Community spiritual programs maintained theological excellence and contemplative depth. Administrative protocols preserved institutional identity and ceremonial dignity. External relationship management followed established patterns that emphasized continuity rather than adaptation. These traditional systems operated effectively within their design parameters while becoming progressively less adequate for managing environmental conditions outside historical experience ranges. The institutional crisis that had been developing gradually through environmental pressure accumulation reached a critical threshold in 1987, when the confluence of demographic, political, and economic changes created operational conditions that exceeded the monastery's adaptive capacity. The triggering mechanism was not a single catastrophic event, but rather the intersection of multiple environmental stress factors that overwhelmed traditional management systems simultaneously. The monastery's response protocols activated according to design specifications, while the underlying institutional physics began operating according to parameters outside the community's analytical frameworks. The failure sequence initiated when traditional resource acquisition systems encountered conditions that rendered established financial models obsolete. Regional Christian population decline had reduced traditional donation streams to levels insufficient for maintaining standard operational expenses. Pilgrimage patterns had shifted due to political instability and demographic changes, eliminating seasonal revenue sources that had provided financial stability for centuries. Government regulations regarding religious community economic activities had created administrative costs and operational restrictions that exceeded the monastery's bureaucratic management capabilities. The community's financial analysis systems interpreted these resource pressures through spiritual rather than institutional categories that emphasized providential trust and simplified lifestyle rather than systematic economic planning. Traditional responses to financial stress involved reducing expenses through increased spiritual discipline and appealing to external Christian communities for emergency assistance. These approaches had proven effective during historical periods of temporary economic difficulty, but they were inadequate for managing systematic resource reduction requiring fundamental institutional restructuring. The monastery's institutional metabolism began operating according to thermodynamic principles that contradicted traditional assumptions about providential sustainability. Input streams of human and material resources were declining at rates that exceeded output reduction capabilities. The community required minimum resource levels for maintaining basic operations, facility maintenance, food provision, administrative compliance, and spiritual programming. As input streams fell below critical thresholds, the monastery faced fundamental choices between maintaining traditional programming standards and ensuring long-term institutional viability. Traditional monastic economic models assumed renewable resource streams based on continuing Christian demographic presence and ongoing recognition of contemplative value. These assumptions had proven valid during historical periods when regional Christian populations maintained sufficient size and economic capacity to support multiple religious institutions. However, demographic mathematics now operated according to different parameters that rendered traditional resource acquisition strategies inadequate for maintaining institutional sustainability. The community's approach to resource allocation during this crisis period reflected embedded assumptions about the relationship between spiritual authenticity and material provision. Traditional monastic theology maintained that faithful contemplative practice would naturally generate necessary external support. Communities that prioritized theological integrity and liturgical excellence could expect divine providence to provide material necessities through appropriate channels. This providential model had functioned effectively during periods of Christian demographic dominance and stable political recognition of religious authority. However, the physical constraints governing institutional survival operated according to mathematical rather than theological principles during environmental stress periods. The monastery required specific quantities of human and material resources for maintaining minimum operational viability, regardless of spiritual authenticity or contemplative depth. As input streams declined below critical thresholds, institutional physics determined survival possibilities according to resource mathematics rather than theological frameworks. The failure cascade accelerated when traditional crisis management protocols created positive feedback loops that increased institutional vulnerability rather than stabilizing operational conditions. Community responses to financial stress emphasized spiritual discipline and reduced external programming, which decreased community visibility and external relationship maintenance at precisely the moment when expanded external engagement was necessary for developing alternative resource acquisition strategies. The monastery's emphasis on contemplative response to crisis situations reduced strategic planning activities when systematic institutional analysis was essential for survival. Traditional spiritual approaches to institutional challenges assumed that internal spiritual development would naturally generate external stability and support. Prayer and theological reflection were understood as primary tools for managing institutional difficulties. Contemplative response to external pressures was expected to demonstrate spiritual maturity and attract divine assistance for practical concerns. These spiritual frameworks had proven effective during historical crisis periods when external communities recognized contemplative authority and when traditional support networks remained viable. However, the environmental conditions that triggered the monastery's institutional crisis operated outside the parameters for which traditional spiritual response protocols had been designed. External communities no longer automatically recognized contemplative authority as culturally valuable. Traditional support networks had been disrupted by demographic transition and political change. Alternative resource acquisition strategies required political and economic rather than purely spiritual engagement approaches. The monastery's information feedback systems began providing contradictory data that challenged fundamental assumptions about institutional sustainability and appropriate crisis response strategies. Financial records documented resource decline rates that exceeded expense reduction capabilities. External relationship assessments indicated declining recognition of monastic cultural value among regional political and religious leaders. Demographic analysis revealed systematic emigration patterns among potential support populations that rendered traditional resource acquisition strategies obsolete. Community decision-making systems processed this contradictory information through spiritual filters that emphasized providential trust and contemplative response rather than strategic analysis and adaptive planning. Traditional theological frameworks interpreted institutional stress as opportunities for spiritual purification, rather than signals requiring systematic institutional restructuring. Crisis situations were understood as occasions for deepening contemplative practice rather than problems requiring strategic assessment and practical solutions. The physical processes governing institutional survival during environmental crisis operated according to thermodynamic principles that remained indifferent to spiritual intentions or theological authenticity. Institutional viability required specific ratios of input resources to operational requirements regardless of contemplative excellence or theological sophistication. As resource acquisition capabilities declined below sustainability thresholds, institutional physics determined survival possibilities according to mathematical rather than spiritual calculations. The monastery's traditional understanding of institutional crisis assumed that external pressures represented temporary disruptions requiring spiritual response rather than systematic environmental changes requiring institutional adaptation. Historical experience suggested that faithful contemplative practice during crisis periods would eventually restore traditional operational conditions through divine providence or external circumstance changes. Community training emphasized spiritual resilience and theological consistency during stress periods rather than strategic analysis and adaptive planning capabilities. However, the environmental transitions that triggered the monastery's institutional crisis represented permanent rather than temporary changes that required strategic adaptation rather than spiritual endurance. Regional demographic patterns had shifted systematically rather than temporarily. Government policies toward religious communities reflected contemporary rather than historical frameworks. Economic conditions operated according to modern rather than traditional parameters. These changes required institutional restructuring rather than spiritual perseverance for successful navigation. The point of no return was reached when resource decline rates exceeded the monastery's capacity for operational expense reduction while maintaining minimum institutional viability requirements. Traditional expense reduction strategies had reached their practical limits without achieving financial sustainability. Alternative resource acquisition approaches would require fundamental changes in institutional programming and external relationship management that contradicted traditional contemplative priorities. The community faced irreversible choices between preserving traditional spiritual identity and ensuring institutional survival. The failure sequence was completed when traditional spiritual response protocols proved inadequate for generating practical solutions to systematic institutional sustainability challenges. Prayer and theological reflection, while spiritually valuable, did not provide information necessary for strategic planning or resource acquisition. Contemplative approaches to institutional crisis, while maintaining community morale, did not generate adaptive strategies appropriate for environmental conditions outside historical experience parameters. The monastery's spiritual sophistication became irrelevant to institutional survival requirements that operated according to physical rather than theological principles. 2:03 a.m. The monastery's stabilization attempts began in late 1987 when community leadership recognized that traditional crisis management protocols had failed to arrest institutional decline and that systematic intervention was necessary for institutional survival. The emergency response framework activated according to established spiritual priorities while incorporating unprecedented strategic elements that represented fundamental departures from historical operational models. These hybrid approaches attempted to preserve essential contemplative identity while adapting institutional systems to environmental conditions outside traditional experience parameters. The initial stabilization strategy emphasized expanded external relationship development through systematic interfaith engagement that exceeded historical theological dialogue frameworks. Community leadership initiated formal partnerships with regional Islamic religious authorities, government development agencies, and international Christian organizations that required political rather than purely spiritual communication protocols. These external relationship expansions represented significant departures from traditional contemplative autonomy models that had prioritized spiritual independence over strategic collaboration. The monastery's approach to interfaith engagement during this stabilization period reflected institutional desperation rather than theological conviction about ecumenical cooperation. Traditional contemplative theology maintained clear boundaries between Christian monastic identity and external religious partnerships. Emergency circumstances forced community leadership to explore collaborative frameworks that compromised traditional spiritual autonomy in exchange for institutional sustainability opportunities. These theological compromises created internal community tension between spiritual authenticity and practical survival requirements. The expanded interfaith programming generated immediate operational complications that exceeded the community's management capabilities. Islamic religious authorities required theological negotiations about Christian presence in predominantly Muslim regions that demanded political rather than purely spiritual expertise. Government development partnerships involved bureaucratic compliance requirements that conflicted with traditional contemplative administrative simplicity. International Christian organization relationships created dependency dynamics that threatened institutional autonomy while providing essential resource access. The monastery's emergency resource acquisition strategies involved fundamental changes in institutional programming that contradicted traditional contemplative priorities. Community leadership developed tourism programming that commercialized contemplative practices for external consumption. Educational initiatives were expanded to include secular rather than purely religious curricula that attracted government funding while compromising traditional spiritual formation models. Economic activities were diversified through business partnerships that required market rather than providential economic frameworks. These resource diversification strategies generated short-term financial stability while creating long-term institutional identity complications. Tourism programming provided necessary revenue streams while subjecting contemplative practices to commercial rather than spiritual evaluation criteria. Educational expansion attracted government support while requiring curricular compromises that diluted traditional theological formation. Business partnerships ensured immediate financial viability while introducing market pressures that conflicted with contemplative economic models based on providential rather than competitive principles. The community's emergency governance modifications attempted to integrate strategic planning capabilities with traditional spiritual decision-making frameworks. Administrative positions were created for external relationship management and financial planning that required expertise outside traditional contemplative formation. Decision-making processes were modified to include systematic environmental assessment and strategic response development alongside established spiritual discernment protocols. These governance changes generated institutional capability for managing contemporary challenges, while creating authority conflicts between traditional spiritual leadership and emergency administrative positions. The hybrid governance systems created systematic tensions between contemplative authenticity and institutional adaptation requirements. Traditional spiritual authority patterns emphasized theological expertise and contemplative maturity as leadership qualifications. Emergency administrative positions required strategic thinking and external relationship management capabilities that conflicted with traditional contemplative priorities. Community decision-making processes struggled to integrate spiritual discernment with strategic analysis when these analytical frameworks generated contradictory conclusions about appropriate institutional responses. The monastery's emergency external communication protocols required systematic departures from traditional religious neutrality models that had protected institutional autonomy during historical political transitions. Regional political developments demanded explicit positioning on contemporary issues rather than traditional theological abstraction from worldly concerns. Government relationship management required political sophistication and strategic compromise rather than traditional ceremonial courtesy and spiritual witness. These communication adaptations preserved immediate institutional viability while compromising traditional contemplative separation from political engagement. The emergency programming modifications created secondary crisis conditions that threatened core institutional identity while providing necessary external support. Expanded tourism activities generated revenue streams while subjecting contemplative practices to external evaluation and commercial pressures. Educational programming diversification attracted government funding while requiring curricular compromises that diluted traditional spiritual formation. Business partnerships provided financial stability while introducing market dynamics that conflicted with contemplative economic models based on providential rather than competitive principles. The community's emergency response systems created positive feedback loops that accelerated institutional identity erosion while providing short-term operational stability. External relationship expansion generated immediate resource access while creating dependency patterns that reduced institutional autonomy. Programming modifications attracted external support while compromising traditional contemplative authenticity. Governance adaptations provided contemporary management capabilities while undermining traditional spiritual authority patterns. These secondary crisis conditions operated according to institutional physics that rendered traditional contemplative identity incompatible with environmental adaptation requirements. The monastery faced systematic choices between preserving spiritual authenticity and ensuring institutional survival that could not be resolved through theological compromise or strategic synthesis. Emergency stabilization measures provided temporary operational viability while creating permanent institutional transformation that rendered traditional monastic identity obsolete. The community's approach to managing secondary crisis conditions reflected systematic confusion about institutional priorities and appropriate response frameworks. Traditional spiritual leadership emphasized contemplative authenticity and theological consistency despite external pressures. Emergency administrative positions prioritized institutional survival and strategic adaptation despite traditional identity concerns. These competing priorities created internal decision-making paralysis when community faced choices between spiritual authenticity and practical viability. The monastery's measurement systems during emergency stabilization periods provided contradictory feedback about institutional success and failure that challenged fundamental assumptions about appropriate evaluation criteria. Traditional spiritual metrics indicated declining contemplative depth and theological authenticity due to external engagement compromises. Strategic assessment frameworks demonstrated improved institutional sustainability and contemporary relevance through emergency programming adaptations. These contradictory measurement systems created systematic uncertainty about institutional progress and appropriate future planning directions. The stabilization attempts revealed fundamental incompatibilities between traditional contemplative institutional models and environmental conditions requiring systematic adaptation for contemporary relevance. The monastery's traditional spiritual identity assumed stable external conditions that would recognize and support contemplative authority. Contemporary environmental requirements demanded strategic flexibility and political engagement that contradicted traditional contemplative priorities. These incompatibilities could not be resolved through theological synthesis or strategic compromise without fundamental institutional transformation. The emergency response period demonstrated that institutional adaptation during environmental transition required systematic rather than incremental changes that exceeded the monastery's cultural and theological adaptation capabilities. Traditional spiritual frameworks provided inadequate analytical tools for processing environmental changes outside historical experience parameters. Contemporary strategic requirements demanded expertise and institutional capabilities that conflicted with traditional contemplative formation and governance models. The stabilization attempts succeeded in providing temporary operational viability while confirming the impossibility of preserving traditional institutional identity during systematic environmental transition. 2:05 a.m. The forensic reconstruction of the monastery's institutional failure sequence began immediately following the collapse of emergency stabilization efforts in 1989, when external investigators and institutional analysts initiated systematic documentation of the failure cascade that had rendered a 15-century-old institution obsolete within a single decade. The post-incident analysis revealed fundamental design flaws in traditional contemplative institutional models that made adaptive failure inevitable during environmental transitions beyond historical experience parameters. The primary forensic evidence emerged from detailed examination of institutional decision-making records that documented systematic patterns of environmental misinterpretation and strategic inadequacy throughout the crisis period. Community meeting minutes revealed consistent prioritization of spiritual discernment over strategic analysis when facing unprecedented adaptive challenges. Financial records demonstrated resource allocation patterns that emphasized traditional programming over environmental assessment and strategic planning capabilities. External communication archives showed systematic reliance on historical frameworks that had become obsolete during demographic and political transitions. The forensic analysis identified specific information processing failures that prevented the community from developing adequate responses to environmental pressures outside traditional experience parameters. The monastery's spiritual measurement systems provided extensive feedback about contemplative progress while remaining systematically blind to institutional sustainability requirements. Strategic planning capabilities were underdeveloped due to theological assumptions that emphasized providential rather than systematic approaches to institutional management. Environmental scanning systems were inadequate because traditional contemplative formation provided no training in demographic analysis, political assessment, or economic planning. Institutional autopsy procedures revealed that the monastery's governance architecture contained structural flaws that made adaptive response impossible during environmental transitions requiring systematic rather than spiritual solutions. Traditional spiritual authority patterns concentrated decision-making power among individuals trained in theological rather than strategic analysis. Community formation processes emphasized contemplative virtues that were irrelevant to institutional adaptation requirements. External relationship management protocols assumed continued recognition of religious authority that had become obsolete during demographic and political transitions. The forensic investigation documented systematic patterns of institutional physics that operated according to thermodynamic principles, regardless of spiritual intentions or theological authenticity. Resource acquisition and allocation systems required specific input-output ratios for maintaining operational viability that remained indifferent to contemplative excellence or theological sophistication. Community sustainability demanded minimum demographic and economic thresholds that could not be maintained through spiritual practice alone when external conditions exceeded traditional support network capabilities. Long-term evidence analysis revealed that institutional failure was structurally inevitable once environmental conditions shifted beyond the parameters for which traditional contemplative models had been designed. The monastery's spiritual sophistication and theological excellence became irrelevant to survival requirements that operated according to mathematical rather than theological principles. Emergency adaptation efforts failed because they attempted to preserve traditional institutional identity while adapting to environmental conditions that rendered traditional identity models obsolete. The post-incident institutional analysis identified specific design ideology failures that had made adaptive response impossible during environmental transition periods. Traditional contemplative theology assumed stable external conditions that would continue recognizing and supporting religious authority. Monastic governance models prioritize spiritual formation over strategic capability development. Resource management systems relied on providential rather than systematic economic frameworks. These design assumptions had proven valid during historical periods of Christian demographic dominance and stable political recognition of religious authority. However, systematic environmental analysis demonstrated that traditional design assumptions had become liability factors during contemporary conditions, requiring institutional adaptation for minority community status. Regional demographic transitions had eliminated traditional support networks while increasing political complexity. Government policy evolution had rendered traditional religious neutrality models inadequate for managing contemporary administrative requirements. Economic conditions demanded strategic rather than providential resource acquisition and management approaches. The forensic reconstruction identified fundamental incompatibilities between traditional contemplative, institutional models and environmental conditions, requiring systematic adaptation for contemporary relevance. Contemplative priorities emphasized spiritual development over external engagement, when environmental adaptation required expanded political and economic relationship management. Theological frameworks prioritized authenticity over effectiveness, when institutional survival demanded strategic compromise and practical adaptation. Traditional governance models concentrated authority among individuals trained in spiritual rather than strategic analysis, when environmental management required contemporary rather than historical expertise. Comparative analysis with other religious institutions during the same period revealed that successful adaptation required systematic abandonment of traditional identity models in favor of hybrid frameworks that integrated spiritual purposes with contemporary operational strategies. Communities that preserved traditional contemplative priorities experienced institutional decline regardless of spiritual excellence or theological authenticity. Institutions that achieved contemporary viability required fundamental transformation that rendered traditional religious identity patterns obsolete. The systemic lessons derived from the monastery's institutional failure analysis revealed that traditional religious institutional models contained structural assumptions about environmental stability that made adaptive response impossible during systematic transitions beyond historical experience parameters. Contemplative formation processes that emphasized spiritual virtues over strategic capabilities created systematic blindness to institutional sustainability requirements. Theological frameworks that prioritized providential over systematic approaches to institutional management rendered communities incapable of managing environmental conditions, requiring political and economic rather than spiritual solutions. The forensic evidence demonstrated that institutional survival during environmental transition required governance systems designed for uncertainty rather than stability. Traditional contemplative models assumed predictable external conditions that would continue recognizing and supporting religious authority. Contemporary environmental conditions demanded adaptive capability for managing unprecedented challenges requiring strategic rather than spiritual expertise. Successful institutional navigation of environmental transition required systematic abandonment of traditional design assumptions in favor of frameworks optimized for managing uncertainty rather than preserving established patterns. The long-term institutional analysis revealed that traditional preservation strategies became extinction mechanisms when environmental conditions shifted beyond design parameters. Emphasis on theological authenticity over strategic effectiveness prevented development of adaptation capabilities necessary for environmental transition management. Prioritization of contemplative virtues over practical competencies created systematic incompetence for managing contemporary institutional requirements. Traditional governance models that concentrated authority among spiritually rather than strategically trained leaders rendered institutional response inadequate for environmental challenges outside historical experience ranges. The systemic implications of the monastery's institutional failure extended beyond traditional religious communities to include all institutions designed for stable environments that encountered systematic environmental transitions beyond adaptive capabilities. Organizations that prioritized traditional identity preservation over strategic adaptation experienced institutional decline when environmental conditions exceeded design parameters. Institutional survival during environmental transition required systematic transformation that rendered traditional identity models obsolete while preserving essential functional purposes through contemporary operational strategies. The forensic reconstruction concluded that institutional failure was structurally inevitable once traditional design assumptions encountered environmental conditions beyond adaptive capacity limits. The monastery's spiritual excellence and theological sophistication became irrelevant to survival requirements that operated according to physical rather than theological principles. Emergency adaptation efforts failed because they attempted impossible synthesis between traditional identity preservation and environmental adaptation requirements that demanded fundamental institutional transformation. The final lesson derived from systematic analysis of the monastery's institutional failure sequence was that environmental transition periods require governance systems designed for managing uncertainty and change, rather than preserving stability and tradition. Contemporary institutional survival demanded strategic capability development over spiritual formation priorities when environmental conditions exceeded traditional support network capabilities. Successful navigation of systematic environmental transitions required abandonment of traditional design assumptions in favor of frameworks optimized for adaptive rather than preservative institutional strategies.